So this chapter or section is all about research methods. Hopefully it's more of a recap. You've been studying research methods like your scientific method probably since like the second grade. So this is the fundamentals to research though, right? This is how we do any research, is we follow the scientific steps or the scientific approach to it. So for research methods, basic research that we do in the field can be done by, any psychologist. But these are some of the more fundamental approaches that we see. Biological perspective, anything to do with the body, the brain, the DNA, genetics, that type of thing. Developmental psychologists. If you ever take like a lifespan or human development class, you'll see it covers birth through death and looks at development from three perspectives: the biological, the cognitive, and the socio-emotional. So any developmental psychologist would study some, age group in life. Cognitive psychologists is about the mind, anything memory related. Alzheimer's research would fall underneath cognitive psychologists. Personality psychologists obviously deal with personality traits, characteristics, what's inherited, what's, learned, the whole nature versus nurture debate on that. And then social psychologists we'll learn about in the social psychology chapter, and that is people like Zimbardo in the Stanford prison experiment, studying groups of people and group interactions, peer pressure, group influence, group biases, implicit bias, that type of thing. Racism, prejudice, that all falls underneath your social psychologist category. So this is some of what your applied research looks like versus the basic research from the fundamental approach on the last slide. This deals more with practical problems. We see a lot of industrial psychologists. There's an IO degree, industrial and organizational psychology, that is a degree that's gaining in popularity, I feel, in recent years. But applied research asks, what's the problem? And this is an important step in resolving that problem. What problems need to be analyzed? What problems exist maybe outside the individual researcher's domain? The researcher's role is to examine analytically, and then a course of action would be recommended to follow that. Versus like basic research on the last slide, is problem-based on the researcher's interest to explain and understand the subject. The selection of the problem is totally the choice of the researcher for basic research. And then there's some value or judgment that may be made. Action is not necessarily recommended in a basic research approach. If you're going to do research, it helps to have these four attitudes towards it. Curiosity, obviously, right? You get curious about something, it makes you want to research it further, and that's what helps develop the initial start to the research process. Skepticism, questioning what's really out there already. Is this true? Is it accurate? Is there another way to think or perceive it? You also need to be objective, though, and this is where you have to really watch that your own biases do not enter into your research. You have to remain objective to the findings, and not try and skew them in the direction that you hoped that they would go. So willingness to think critically. Obviously, critical thinking is an important part of the research and scientific approach. You have to be able to think outside the box to, examine the data that's collected or the, research that you're gathering, to look at things from a different perspective, something that's not the norm, something that hasn't already been discovered or thought upon. So this is why I said that, you've been learning this since like the second grade, because this is the basics to the steps to research, right? So first you have to think about an idea, what it is that you want to do, right? So you're going to sit back and observe, right? And then you're going to start to question it and be like, what can I do differently? Or what's missing here? Or, what do I want to know from these observations? And then you have to do the research on, well, what has other people studied on this? What's already been conducted? And what research has been done, and what are the findings on that. When you do a research project, especially if you're going to go for your master's and you have to do a thesis, or you're going to do your dissertation for your PhD, you have to find something that's never been researched before and research that. So you have to find like a hole or a gap in the theory or the research that's out there already. So that alone can, the research part, step 3, can take a long time to figure out exactly what direction to take this observation and this, questioning that you're doing in the first couple of steps. And then, your hypothesis is just like an educated guess, like, this is going to happen and this is what you think the results are going to be to that. So then you perform it, right? You get the information on your hypothesis and see what the outcomes are. So once you gather all that, once you've, tried to prove this hypothesis, then you have to analyze the data. And so this is done through statistics, which is everybody's favorite topic, right? Statistics, yay! Um, I, I didn't have to take statistics until I got to my PhD, and wow, that was something. I was very fortunate. I got an A in both my statistics classes as a PhD student, but that was some work, let me tell you, to try and get through it. But the basics to statistics is things that we start to learn in math and in grammar school and elementary school. So we'll talk about those in a little bit. And then your conclusion. You have to draw your conclusion. You've analyzed the data, so tell us what you found. What are the results to this survey? And then as you read journal articles and things in your classes, you'll see there's like a limitations and discussion section at the end. And so that's where you identify any potential problems that may have arisen, so that you've addressed them, so that you're aware that this is an issue. So you don't want it to, problems that arise to take away from the findings of the research. And then it's also a good place to look. If you're looking to do research, read people's limitations and discussions, and that kind of gives you an idea of what further direction that this research could go. So I always ask the question in class, what's more important, validity or reliability? You absolutely have to have validity, and you hope for reliability. And this is content validity, really, because there's a number of different types of validity. But content validity is super important. If you are going to take an ACT test or an SAT test, those questions on the test better match what would be on an ACT or an SAT test, right? You wouldn't ask somebody about their personality traits on an ACT test or an SAT test, right? So the validity, the content has to be valid. It has to measure what the test intended it to measure. And you hope for the reliability. You hope for the consistency. So if you're going to do a study on like how sleep affects students' performance on an ACT test, you hope that you can take this study, this research, and do it across any high school, any junior class in throughout the United States and get the same results, right? Then it's reliable. If you can repeat it over and over again and, get the same type of outcome, then, your test is reliable, your research is reliable. Something like this ACT sleep study test would be considered quantitative data. You're analyzing scores, you're analyzing the amount of hours they slept and how it impacts their scores. So that's all through a statistical analysis that we can computate this numerical data. A qualitative test is open-ended. There's not a hypothesis that's associated with qualitative like you see with quantitative. And so you're, asking questions, open-ended questions to your participants. When I did my PhD, I did a qualitative research study. And so I focused it on PBIS, or PBS, which is positive behavior intervention support, or just positive behavior support. And it's what we see in the elementary schools today. So kids are given like a slip of paper for doing good. And I got the idea from subbing. I used to sub in the elementary schools a lot when I was first getting going in the colleges and not teaching a whole lot. And I'm sitting in this office, and I was going to sub art for the day, which my minor for my bachelor's degree is in art. So I like to do that as much as I could. And there wasn't a physical classroom for art. So it was like art on a cart. And so I would go to the student's classroom and teach. And so I'm sitting in the art office waiting, and the principal gets on the loudspeaker. and doing the morning announcements. And they're like, congratulations to so and so's class. They got the owl certificate for lining up in the hallway quietly for lunch. And I'm just thinking head to the hand or hand to the head type of thing. Like, oh my God, did they just say this? Like, we have to really reward a whole class with a slip of paper because they did the most basic of things, which is lining up in the hallway quietly for lunch. Like, I it's part of Skinner's work, which you'll learn about in the learning theories chapter. And I don't want to get too much into that right now. But I love Skinner's theory. I think he's right on with it. I agree with a lot of it, but I don't think we use his theory the way it was intended to. Part of what Skinner's theory says, his ideas like the whole reinforcements and punishments, is that the hope for the reward is actually more of an incentive than the reward itself. So if we're always throwing slips of paper at kids like, hey, great job, kind of like the whole everybody gets a trophy in sports for participation, it loses its effect and its meaning. And so why are the kids going to work hard for it when it's just expected that, oh yeah, I'm going to get it? And so I think we've stretched his theory a little bit too much. And so that's what I focused my research on for my PhD. And so I interviewed teachers on the effectiveness of how it's implemented in their schools. And what I found was that most of the teachers did not like the system, but they didn't like it because of how it was run or the lack of participation or from all teachers, or the principal didn't really get behind it. So there's a variety of reasons as to why they didn't like it. But there was one teacher, she was, or maybe it was a he, I can't remember which participant it was, but just all for it, just really excited, energetic, thought it was like the best thing in the world. And so obviously I wasn't looking for that, right? I'm trying to speak out against it because there's so much support for it and so much in favor of it. But, I can't skew the results. I, have to report what was given to me. But for the most part, I, found what I was looking for in the research. So enough to say that, the results are credible. So the three goals that we have of the research is the description, right? We have to collect systematic observations when we do this. Then we make our prediction. We also have to identify variables, independent, dependent variables, control variables, things that happen in experiments that we don't necessarily have control over. Some participant gets sick last minute and can't participate, right? So we want to try and limit those control variables as much as we can. And then the explanation, right? We're trying to establish some cause and effect of the experiment that we're conducting, and that's done through our hypotheses. So there's really two types of observations that we do. So naturalistic is the one that I focused on here. And so this is, if you want to see how kids interact with each other, go to the park, sit and watch them. I always ask this question too. So if you are at the park and you're observing 5-year-olds interacting with one another, maybe you're observing their gross motor capabilities or their language development, can you take pictures of them? And the answer to that, because I know you're probably thinking in your head, no, the answer to that is yes. So if you're going to publish the information, then you either have to get permission or you have to blur out the faces, which is sometimes what you see like on the news and stuff. You see images blurred. It's because they didn't have permission to, put them on camera. Same thing if you want to video record. You can video record children at the park playing, but you just can't, publish that without consent or blurring the images. And it's always like, students always think, oh, it's creepy to sit at the park and just, watch the kids play and record them and take pictures. But for observational purposes, I mean, this happens all the time. Don't you people watch all the time? You go to the mall and you're sitting in the food court eating and you're looking around and you're watching people. It's just normal. We do it all the time. This is when you think about, recording kids, people are like, oh, that's weird. But we are completely in the, allowed to do so. The great thing about naturalistic observation is you get to see people in their natural habitats, their ways. They're not acting a certain way because they're, in a certain environment or in a restricted environment. The other type of research is the laboratory research, but that, is great because you absolutely have control over that setting. But are you getting the person to act or talk in a way that they normally would if they were in a natural environment? Right, so that's kind of the drawback to that. So I'm going to go through a few more of these terms here, right? So hypotheses are always written as if this happens, then this is the result, which you'll do for your scientific method assignment too, right? When you write the hypotheses. And then you come up with some kind of operational definition, which helps to explain your hypotheses. You figure out who your sample is, and then you got your control group and your experimental group, and then your independent and dependent variable. So let's go back to this ACT study, right? So if students get 4 hours of sleep, then they will score under the national average of 21.9 on the ACT test. Okay. So that could be our working hypotheses. So our experimental group would be the group that's allowed to sleep for only 4 hours, and our control group would be the group that's allowed to sleep the normal 6 to 8 hours that you're supposed to get in the night, right? Your independent variable is the one that's manipulated. So if you can identify what's different between the two groups, then you can figure out what the independent variable is. So in this case, what's different between the two groups is sleep. All right, sleep is what we see as difference. One group sleeps for 4 hours, one group sleeps for 8 hours. The dependent variable is the outcome. What do we want to know? We want to know the ACT scores. So the exam scores would be your dependent variable. All right? And so we are doing this kind of on a volunteer basis to some point, but we also need to be mindful of some of these control variables that I mentioned. So when we're collecting a sample and figuring out who can participate in this, we want to get people of the same intelligence. You don't want to have somebody that has a 4.0 GPA with somebody that has a 2.0 GPA, because we can already kind of predict how they're going to score on the ACT test, right? It's expected that the 4.0 student would score higher than the 2.0 student. So you need to really narrow down the GPA, right? So maybe you test students that have a 3.0 to a 3.5 GPA, and that's the group that you go with. Other than that, you might want to look at, have they taken a practice test? Have they gone to an ACT workshop before? You might want to find out if they have an IEP, if they eat breakfast in the morning. Those are some of the control variables. Do they have any health risks? Any health issues that they're facing? Might be another question that you ask. So you might want to know socioeconomic status. You might want to know birth order. You might want to know if they come from a single parent household or a two-parent household. And not that all this information is necessarily going to impact your results, but the more information you can gather and kind of control and come up with the right people that are going to be a good fit for your study, the better off you're going to be. When you're choosing participants, so let's say you want 50 people for the participants and you have 100 people that match all the criteria that we've come up with. You want to do a random sample of them. And for the random sample, you're going to want to go and not include any bias, right? So if you have 100 names, you can't just call people by names because you might have bias towards a name. You might have, John on the list, and John's a friend of yours, and so you're going to pick John, right? Or you dated Jane and you don't like Jane anymore, so Jane doesn't get to, be picked anymore. So that could be, something you want to try and avoid. So maybe picking every third person or fifth person on the list, and you just, keep repeating the list over and over again until you get all your participants. Same idea as, like pulling a name out of a hat idea, to try and eliminate any potential for bias. Just like if you're sitting in a room and, you have all your 100 participants are there, you can't point them out. You might point at a certain person because of how they look, or you don't call that person because of how they look. So we need to try and eliminate as much of the bias as we possibly can. So the measures of central tendency is what you've, like I said, been doing since probably the fourth grade. So you find the mean, the median, the mode, the range, your frequency distribution, your standardized standard deviation. All of this is part of the statistical tools that you use to analyze the data that you're gathering, right? And so we collect all the exam scores, right? And we can use the measures of central tendency to find out what our average is. So when you find the mode, that's the one that's most common, right? So if we look at this 11 different students that are on here, what's the number that we see repeated the most, right? So it looks like it would be 250, right? So we see the number 250 3 times, so that's our mode. That's the one that's the most common. If, let's say, 400 was on here 3 times and 250 was on here 3 times, then we could say we have 2 modes, 250 and 400. If they were all up here just one time and nothing was repeated, we could say we have no mode. All right, so there's 3 different options for that. In order to find the median, we have to put things in order from smallest to largest. Right? And so that's what we've done here. So we start off with 0 at the bottom and we go up to 850. So we have an odd number, right? So we're going to count up 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're going to count down 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Both times we get this number 6. So 375 would be considered our median number. If you have an even number, right? So let's say we just had 1 through 10, then you would take the 2 in the middle, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you would take your 400 and your 375, you would add them together and divide by 2, and that would be your median as an answer. And then for the mean, you could add up all those numbers. So it went from 0 to 850 on the last slide. So you add them all up. There's 11 numbers. You divide by 11, and that's your mean or your average score. So when all was said and done in research, we're making correlations between things, but we can't say that they're causations, right? So we can say that there's a correlation in our findings, that sometimes this is linked to this and this is the outcome, but we can't say that just because this happens, this is the outcome. Just like, like even something like lung cancer and smoking. There's a correlation, but we can't say there's a causation because there could be other external or environmental or hereditary factors that, go into it. Not every person that smokes gets lung cancer. Not every person that has lung cancer has smoked. So we can say there's a correlation between nicotine and lung cancer, but we can't say it's a causation, which is true on a lot of research. And to wrap up our research methods here, we talk about the placebo effect. So the placebo is something that's fake, right? And so when we're testing a new drug, we give some participants the actual drug, and we give some participants a placebo, a fake pill. And that helps them to, the researchers to know, who's being affected by the drug and who's not, right? And so oftentimes it's just like saline or a sugar pill or just something like that, kind of mimic or give the idea that the actual, drug is being given. And so we do like a double-blind experiment sometimes. A single-blind experiment is where the participants aren't aware of who's getting the drug. The double-blind experiment is where the researchers are unaware as well which group or which participants have the drug itself, which can be beneficial to try and, again, keep that bias out of the research. So Generally speaking, it takes about 10 years to get a drug approved before the FDA will, sign off on it. Uh, and that's after many trials and experiments and participants. And yeah, so it's about a 10-year process to get something approved. And that's it for research methods today.